It's time for Health Futures with Cypress HomeCare Solutions, Bob Roth. This is Arizona's only show dedicated to providing you with expert advice on how to live a longer, healthier, and happier life. To learn more, call 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Bob Roth.
Good afternoon. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you, and it must be Friday. We're coming at you live from the Scottsdale Air Park, and you're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. Today is February 16th, and if this is the first time you are listening to our show is about how our older adult population can live a healthier, happier life. And how do we do this? We bring extraordinary guests to the show. And I want to just jump right in and introduce our guest. She is a return guest. She was on our show back in August 2017, and we actually played her as one of the best of for the very beginning of February. I'm sure she isn't aware of this, but I'm going to tell her now. Dr. Martha Gulati, Chief of Cardiology, University of Arizona, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's good to have you back in the show, and we actually played your broadcast back on Friday, February 2nd, and it happened to be Wear Red Day. And I was wearing red that day, and I was telling our listeners, actually, James did the intro. James, our extraordinary engineer, and he said this is one of the best of shows, and I wanted to play that show because it is near and dear to me. And it's near and dear to me, and for our listening audience, I am in the caregiving business, and I am in the caregiving business because I found myself in 1985, January 2nd, put into the role of being a caregiver for my mother. At 48 years old, she suffered a major heart attack, and about two-thirds of her heart died that day, and she was never really quite the same and lived 18 years. And as a result of that experience, my brothers and I started Cypress HomeCare Solutions to care for other people's moms and dads in the way we did our own mom. And it is amazing just to watch. I mean, that was January 2nd, 1985. Fast forward almost 33 years, and how much has changed in medicine, and how much has changed in cardiology, and how much has changed in the difference between men and women, which is something that you talk a lot about, Dr. Gulati. Can I call you Martha?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Thank you. You talk a lot about in your book, Saving Women's Hearts, and I want to really talk a little bit more about that. Last time when you were on the show, we were talking about risk factors, modifiable versus non-modifiable risks. But this time I really want to talk about saving women's hearts. And as you know, and as I just shared with the listening audience, it's near and dear to me. And how can you prevent and reverse heart disease with natural and conventional strategies? And I was not really aware, and you shared this with me last time, that women were not included in clinical trials prior to, I think it was 1995?
Pretty much. I mean, when I think of the time that your mother had a heart attack, at that time, since 1982, more women had been dying from heart disease than men, and yet it really wasn't on our radar to even include them in our studies. So when you look back at most of the studies that really fundamentally changed cardiology and changed what we do and what we know about hearts, majority of the studies did not include women. And still to this day, I would tell people we push to get more women into trials, but it's at best somewhere around 25 to 30% in the current trials that are ongoing of percentage of women in those trials. And so we still have a lot of questions. We still, wonder why women aren't included in trials. We try to push the issue. And it starts actually even before you do human trials. I mean, when you think about science for even the lay person, we do cell studies, we do animal studies, and then usually the next thing is human studies. The funny part is back in the 90s, when we realized we were ignoring women, we did say that if you apply for government funding to do research, you have to include women in order to get that funding. And so people started making an effort because if they didn't have a plan for how they were going to enroll women, they didn't get the funding from the government. On the other hand, what people didn't realize was that the cell studies and animal studies had no obligation to use female cell lines or female animals. And that has hindered us. And it was only in 2014 that the head of the NIH, Francis Collins, and Janine Clayton actually noticed that, wait, we told people to do it in humans, but guess what? Cell line studies, animal studies are predominantly male, unless they were female-specific diseases like breast cancer, uterine cancer, or things like that. So they actually made it mandatory now, if you're going to do basic science research, as of the 2016, you had to have both sex lines involved in cell lines and in animal studies. And we jokingly said maybe the reason was male mice were cheaper than female mice. Maybe female mice didn't like being locked up in a cage. I don't know what it was, but it's really interesting that we don't have the basic science that usually builds us, where we see a signal either by cell lines or by animal studies saying this might be a promising therapy, or this is a difference between the men and women mice. Male and female mice, sorry. And then maybe that we'll see the same effect in humans. And we're almost doing it backwards now. So we're catching up, because that only went into effect in 2016.
I know. It's hard to believe it.
We're 2018, so we haven't even seen that research yet. It should be rolling out now, where we see things.
It's amazing how in the mid-90s is when we recognized it, but fast forward 20 years and we're still not doing the adequate studies.
We're at the infancy, and that's what I tell my patients. I take care actually almost exclusively of women, and I tell them that we as women have to be our own advocates. We are often labeled as women as a special population, and I say that with air quotes, but we're not. Well, we're special. Of course we're special.
Of course you are.
But we are 52% of the population. If we don't know how to treat 52% of the population, we are failing our population. And as women who maybe have access to senators and congressmen and powerful people that can affect change, we need to take the opportunity to ask why they don't care about more than our bikini lines. Breast and reproductive system, don't get me wrong, they're important. I'm glad we take care of that. I'm glad we know so much about that. But behind that is all the other organs. And of course, I can only speak as a cardiologist about the heart and the vascular system, but I'm sure that if you talked with somebody who did GI, the gastrointestinal system, they would tell me maybe there's sex differences there too. And I bet you they haven't been studied, because we just concentrate almost exclusively on men. And men have dictated health. They've been the leaders both in medicine and from governmental organizations. And I think that it's taken women getting into this field, women getting into Congress. All of it has been because we actually partner with them to help push ahead our agenda, to include women, to get trials, to get funding, to have an Office of Women's Health. I mean, that was a huge undertaking, and that really was from women senators, women Congress women, and physicians that banded together. And in cardiology, we've done the same thing, where we sit there and we talk with them and we tell them why it's important, and they have helped us push our agenda forward on the governmental level.
You brought up GI and many other challenges medically that women and men face. But cardiology, when you look at the 10 causes of death, the heart attack is number one.
Yeah.
Number one. And when you talk about the bikini approach, and I read this in your book, Dr. Nanette Wenger, I think, is the pioneer of research in women. And she mentioned that, breast cancer has a death rate of 1 in 30. Heart attacks, 1 in 3 for women?
Yep.
1 in 3, and we live the sedentary lifestyle. We as a society, and trust me, Martha, you live a much different lifestyle. You told me you're a marathon runner and you eat right, but I mean, you do everything you can to prevent heart disease. But 1 in 3 will suffer from heart disease. And that's crazy. And if we don't do something about it soon, it'll be 1 in 2.
Exactly.
I mean, you think about being in line at a concert or a sporting event, and you're in line at the ticket window, or you're in line for the restroom. Look at the person in front of you. Look at the person behind you. One of you is going to die of heart disease. We have so much more to cover. And as you can hear, Coldplay is taking us out. We are going to take a break. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. And I've got Dr. Martha Gulati here in the studio. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress HomeCare Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. If you're just tuning in, we're on our second segment. I've got Dr. Martha Gulati. She is from the University of Arizona. She is the chief of cardiology. And we were talking at the first segment, we were talking about women's hearts, and we were talking about her book that she published called Saving Women's Hearts. And we were talking about the fact that, a lot of the research that has been predominantly done on men and not on women, and how even though it was discovered back in the mid-90s, we're just starting to really peel back that onion and really starting to get into a lot of the research that is being done in women's hearts.
Yeah, I think that, we are, it's an exciting time as a physician, and specifically a physician who focuses on women's hearts, is that we now have research actually coming out that applies to half our population, and we're being better equipped to be able to treat our patients, which is, it's taken a long road to get here.
It has. And, when you really look at the genders, and I specifically do because we are in the caregiving business, and if you were to ask me the census of caregivers that we have over 200 caregivers, and I would say over 80% of them are women. And not only being paid caregivers, but those that are out in our communities predominantly are women. They're raising children, they're caring for their older adult parents, they're just caring, compassionate people. And the amount of stress that must bring on, as well as women are typically the nurturers and help raise their families. They help that with keeping up the household. So the amount of stress that women go through must make things even more challenging as it relates to hearts.
Well, I think it does. I mean, the whole workforce has changed where women, are now, more likely to work actually than men in our population, and then additionally have the burden usually. I mean, again, it's a generalization, but we do see that even professional women, even whatever field you're in, women tend to work at home more than the men. And so they tend to have more childcare responsibilities, and when the children grow up, they are more likely to have parental responsibilities, where if there is a sick parent, they end up taking care of them predominantly. And all of that is stress, and it actually can affect your heart. We actually have a big focus on caregivers to not just be taking care of the person that they are focused on, whether it's a child or an older adult or even a loved one who's had some sort of illness, but that they also need time to be taken care of or take care of themselves, because often, especially women, put their health last. If you ask a woman to prioritize, what are the most important things in their life, they will first usually list their children. Husband might be second, or their own parents will be next. Husband will be after that. And then when they put their own health, will be way down at the bottom of the list. And so that is a big issue. I mean, we even have women who have heart attacks. And I don't know, again, the story entirely related to your mom, but, sometimes a woman can be having a symptom of a heart attack. They know something's wrong, but the reason they'll delay getting to the hospital or calling 911 or even saying anything that something is wrong is they're like, I've got lots of things to do. Let me make the dinner. Let me get pick up the kids. Let me do this. Let me do that. Oh, the house is dirty. I'm not going to call 911. And there's a whole laundry of list of things that they put before themselves. And unfortunately, that I think is affecting women, and we have to empower women to take care of themselves too. They're not, one of the things I tell for my women is that I understand you have all these other people that rely on you, and for you to be there, you have to be healthy. So let's make sure we take care of you. That's the only way that we can make sure that they have you. So your health matters to them as much as their health matters to you.
You know, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting because you bring up about more women are into the workforce than ever before. And statistically, and I got this from the MIT Age Lab, women earn more BA and BS degrees than men since 1978, more graduate degrees since 1988. Women are really they're controlling, 2/3 of them are going to control the consumer wealth over the next decade. They're the key buyers, 89% of consumer electronics, 65% of automobiles, 80% of home improvements, and 90% of healthcare decisions. Our society needs women to be healthy. They really do. That is our future.
And I think one thing that I can tell you, just University of Arizona, where we are unique, just to do a shameless plug for us, we actually have 60% of our medical school class, the first year class, is women.
Wow.
We're 50% in the nation, which is great. We're pretty equal now in terms of medical classes. But University of Arizona here in Phoenix
60.
has managed to get 60% women this year.
And what did that look like 20 years ago? 30 years ago? I mean, it had to be, what, 20, 25? I mean, I'm taking a guess.
Yeah, it's gradually. You can look at that. We have the data for the U.S. Through the AAMC, which is our Association of American Medical Colleges, and you can see this gradual increase that we've been seeing continually, which has been great. That's what we needed to see. Because medicine, again, you're right. Women drive healthcare decisions in their families.
90%.
Exactly. They tell their family where to go. They're going to decide where their children go, but they also decide where their husband goes. They're going to decide care decision making for loved ones, no matter who that is. And yet, it should shock women if they have that much power and they're spending that much money. Yet we've put their health in general as a lower priority compared to issues related to men.
We do. And, one of the things that you talk about in your book is you talk about stress and the profound effect that it has more on women than it does on men. And, I know that, whether it's relationships with their spouses, their significant others, their children, caregiving, women are more likely to think of others than themselves. And, how would you suggest that women manage their stress better so that they can reduce the risk of potentially having a heart disease or a heart attack?
Well, I think for women, it's so important that they take care of themselves too. And that means giving yourself time to decompress from whether it's your work day, whether it's your children, whether it's your spouse. And some of the things that you can do if you're feeling guilty, there's a lot of women working and they feel guilty that they're not spending enough time with their children. But then spend time with your children also doing something that will benefit you, whether that's exercising and running in a field with your family and just feeling free. Disconnect the cell phone. I will tell you, the cell phone and the attachment we all have to our cell phone has really changed our life. Not only do we constantly get barraged with emails, we also get barraged with news alerts on our phone, and lots of people don't know how to stop that. And so then every time there's a tweet that disrupts our universe, people are stressed out by that. And we've seen a lot more stress recently just with our political environment. And so sometimes it's just important to disconnect, maybe making a time, scheduling a time on your calendar or with your family between 6 and 8 o'clock p.m. We do not look at cell phones. We disconnect, we turn them off. Making decisions about exercise, scheduling in me time, whether that's at a spa, whether that's exercise, whether it's meditation, whether it is just going for a walk and taking care of yourself.
Now, all great points, and it's interesting you bring up the news, because when you and I sat down before we got it here in the studio, the 17 or more deaths that just happened at that high school down in Florida is just devastating. and you can't get away from it. I mean, even someone like yourself who knows, you're a doctor, knows that, I need to turn this stuff off, but it is all over the place, and all of our hearts in our country right now are broken, and feeling for those families and those loved ones and friends that are going through the stress of having lost a child.
Yeah.
We're at halftime here at Health Futures, taking stock in you. We're up for a break. Stick around. We're going to talk a little bit more about healthy hearts in women when we get right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress HomeCare Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. I'm your host, Bob Roth, and if you're just tuning in, we're on our third segment. I've got Dr. Martha Gulati. She's the Chief of Cardiology for University of Arizona here in the studio. And in the first two segments, we were talking about women's health, mainly women's hearts, and how we are now finally doing studies to really understand the differences between men and women, but more so how we can eliminate this being the number one killer of women. And of course it is of men, but the symptoms are very, very different. And that's what I want to just kind of segue into right now, Martha. Can you tell us how these symptoms are different? Because, I think most people that are listening in right now think about the person just clutching their chest. And that is maybe the primary symptom that people are used to seeing. What are some of the symptoms that you are finding in women versus men that are different that our listening audience can really be cognizant of when seeing somebody that might be in distress, or if a woman is listening right now, might notice, hey, when I'm having this pain in my stomach or abdomen, this could be a cardiac event I'm having.
So the most important thing is to understand that 2/3 of women will have the same symptoms as a man, and what we call typical symptoms of angina or a heart attack. And we don't want women to dismiss them and think somehow they have to be different for me to be having a heart attack. So 2/3 of women will have sort of those classic symptoms. It might feel like chest pain, chest pressure, a tightness in the chest, a squeezing. Might feel, as I've heard descriptions of an elephant sitting on my chest or an elastic band tightening across my chest. And often people will clutch their fist and kind of hold it up to where their heart sits. And it's an instinctive thing that we see happening. We call that, actually, it's got a name. Levine sign is the name for it. And when we see people do that when they're describing it, we're like pretty sure that it has to do with their heart. And they might have associated symptoms, feeling hot and sweaty. They might have back pain, jaw pain, neck pain, or left shoulder and left arm pain associated with it. And those are the classic symptoms. And if you are experiencing them, and you think you're having a heart attack, or if you're at risk for a heart attack, or you're not sure, you should be calling 911. Now, for a third of women, they are what are labeled as atypical symptoms. And by atypical, I hate that word, but they're just not what we used to see and we're used to seeing in men. And those might be more subtle. They might be just shortness of breath or profound fatigue, something they could do yesterday and they can't even barely get out of bed. They might have all those other symptoms I described, like left arm pain, left shoulder pain, neck pain, jaw pain, and back pain, either together or alone, but without any symptoms of chest pain or chest pressure, which is sometimes why they get dismissed in the emergency room when they're having symptoms of a heart attack. Because again, we haven't trained necessarily all our physicians to recognize the more atypical symptoms. And again, I hate that term atypical, but that's how they get labeled. But if you're at risk for heart disease and you're having symptoms like that, again, we tell people to call 911. Part of the reason, though, that we haven't had a good recognition of the symptoms even to the public is when we think of heart attacks, we think of what we see, the figures that we see, whether it's a drawing depicting someone having a heart attack, or when we watch movies, it's usually we see men having a heart attack. Often some important person is with a mistress having a heart attack. That's the Hollywood heart attack, if you will. But wonderfully, depicted recently in the last 2 weeks on a very popular television show called Grey's Anatomy. The head female surgeon had a heart attack, and she was African American. African American women actually have a 1 in 2 chance of developing heart disease.
1 in 2. Wow.
And they're at high risk, and they showed, it was actually the woman who writes the show Grey's Anatomy. She is an actor, and she depicted herself having a heart attack. And I was so grateful in that moment, because I felt that not only did she not use a typical story where it's always the man having a heart attack, it was where a woman was having a heart attack.
It's incredible that even Hollywood has even brought that to the attention, and really it is interesting about women, and we talked about in the last segment, just the amount of stress they must undergo raising their children, keeping the household up, and working as a working person. They just, I would think, and men are guilty of it too. They ignore the severity of the symptoms, and I love the fact that you walk through some of those here for our audience here today, so that they can at least be cognizant. If you are having symptoms, as you have described, you should go in and get it looked at, and not wait to have an appointment with your doctor, go to the hospital.
Yeah, the heart is a muscle. And when blood supply is not flowing, because that's what a heart attack is where the blood supply is getting blocked, the only treatment can begin is when you get to the hospital or when the ambulance shows up at your house. So we always tell people, don't drive yourself there. Don't have a loved one drive you there. Call 911, because they can start treatment the minute they see you in your house. So you don't want to delay things by you going. Remember, the ambulance can go fast and get you to the hospital the fastest, and they can start treatment. And then to your point related to stress, just a point that's unique to women. Of course, stress can affect men and women and their hearts. And we know type A personalities, there's an increased risk of heart attacks, even when no other risk factor exists. But for women, stress, emotional distress, good or bad, that women seem more prone to something called broken heart syndrome. And it is the acute effect of stress on the heart that mimics a heart attack, looks in every way, shape, and form as a heart attack, but we don't see that classic blockage in the coronary artery. And that is just one way that women differ from men, but it is a true thing. We call it Takotsubo's cardiomyopathy or broken heart syndrome. There's been a lot in the press about that recently as well, and it's something that is more common in women. Again, emotional stress, good or bad. We've seen it where people have screamed surprise as a surprise birthday party, and a woman has dropped down and then basically had a heart attack.
OMG. Wow. Really, OMG. And, some of the symptoms you described before, shortness of breath, jaw pain, back pain, nausea, vomiting, sleep disturbances or fatigue, stress, all lead to having potentially of having a heart attack. And these are all signs that we need to be cognizant of. And again, as I say, women really underestimate the severity of what they're going through. So if you are feeling any of those and the classic symptoms, you need to go get seen. And like you said, don't wait. Get in an ambulance and go. I mean, I think a lot of times people feel they call 911. Oh, it's not that bad. Like you said, it is the biggest muscle in your body, the most important muscle in your body. You're not getting blood flow. The only way you're going to get that reversed is by getting medical help, and the hospital is probably the best place you can go.
Exactly. And it's not the biggest muscle in the body, because actually the heart is really the size of your fist, but it is the most important. The heart is necessary to pump blood to the rest of the body, to all the other organs, to your muscles, and it can't work without blood flow. Exactly.
So talk to me about aspirin. What are your recommendations on aspirin? Men versus women? Do you take it at night? Do you take it in the morning? Real quick.
Yeah, so aspirin is important. We know from a primary prevention. If you're having a heart attack, one of the quick things you can do if you think you're having a heart attack is actually chew an aspirin and wait for the ambulance to show up. But if we're talking about primary prevention, which means you don't have heart disease, but you're wondering if taking an aspirin is a good thing, you should talk with your physician. We know that it might benefit both men and women in terms of taking an aspirin, depending on your risk of heart disease. The problem for women is there's more bleeding related to aspirin use. And so we want to make sure that the benefit is greater than the risk.
Okay, and when we are talking about aspirin, we're talking baby aspirins, right? Or are we talking any aspirin?
We should be talking about baby aspirin.
Okay.
But some people use that interchangeably, and so it's a really good question. The dose, if you're taking it from a preventive therapy, is a baby aspirin, but it's really a question, does everyone need it? And you would sometimes, when you watch commercials, you'd get the idea that everyone should, and probably that is not true.
And baby aspirin's like, what, 0.83 milligrams, 0.81 milligrams?
It's 81 milligrams.
81 milligrams. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gulati. We're up against a break. We're down 3 segments. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Now back to Health Futures, taking stock in you. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call 602-264-8009. Now, here's your host, Cypress Home Care Solutions, Bob Roth.
Welcome back. You're listening to Health Futures, taking stock in you. I am your host, Bob Roth, and we're on our 4th segment. And if you're just tuning in, I've got Dr. Martha Gulati here in the studio. She's Chief of Cardiology for the University of Arizona. And if you missed the first 3 segments, you can catch them up on our website at cypresshomecare.com. Hit the media button, hit the drop down to the radio show, and you can catch the first 3 segments and about 190 others that we've been bringing to you since for the last 5 years. So I want to just jump back into it. This is our 4th segment, and we've got just so much to cover. And I've learned a great deal from you personally as well as from your book. One thing that I want to go over a couple items here. Strokes account for more deaths amongst women, and oral contraceptives and smoking are a big contributor to that. Is that correct?
That is true, especially strokes in young women, because obviously using contraceptives tends to be a younger woman's medication.
Sure.
And if you take an oral contraceptive and you smoke, that puts you at a very high risk of stroke. And the problem is that a lot of times maybe the physician who's prescribing the contraceptives doesn't know that the individual woman smokes as well. It's an important conversation to have, especially as women get older and still remain on the birth control pill.
So that's really important for our listening audience to hear this. I mean, smoking is not good for you, period. We should not be smoking cigarettes, but you get the double whammy if you're taking oral contraceptives, you're taking the birth control. So, if you're listening in and you are one of those people or you know someone doing that, you should know that, and you should probably be talking to your doctor about that. The other thing is that I learned was diabetes doubles the risk of a second heart attack in women, but not in men.
Yeah, diabetes is really interesting in that way. Diabetes, for men and women increases your risk for heart disease. And we always say that diabetes is basically a coronary disease equivalent, meaning if you're diabetic, we think there's a high chance that you have heart disease as well. But for women, it's much stronger relationship that if you're a diabetic woman, you have a greater chance to go on and have a heart attack or have a stroke compared to a man who has diabetes. And again, diabetes is more prevalent in women than it is in men, probably because it's linked also to obesity, and obesity rates are higher in women than in men. But we don't know. These are the sex differences that we are so curious about. Why does diabetes affect women more? Is it that we don't get the blood sugar controlled as well in women? Or is there something physiologically that happens to our vasculature or to our clotting because you're a diabetic? And then again, for women, something that's unique, and I think that doesn't get a lot of airtime, if you will, or exposure, is the fact that women go through different things in their lives that almost tell us they're foreshadowing their risk of heart disease, and yet don't get talked a lot about. Things that happen during pregnancy, right? Those things don't happen to men. And I always say pregnancy is nature's free stress test. It's the only thing free we get in our lives.
I love it.
But for women, we see if you, in pregnancy, if you have these complications, one related to diabetes, if you get something called gestational diabetes, so diabetes during pregnancy, you are more likely to not just go on and develop future diabetes, but you're more likely to go on and develop heart disease. Similarly, other things that happen during pregnancy, hypertension during pregnancy, or something, the most severe form is called preeclampsia. If you had those during pregnancy, you're at much higher risk, not just for future hypertension, but for heart disease, for diabetes, for chronic kidney disease. And so we have more and more data emerging about that. Additionally, some research we just did that was published 2 weeks ago, one of the papers I just wrote was related to preterm delivery. And we're finding that women who deliver early, and that definition is 37 weeks of gestation, women who have that have a greater risk of going on and have heart disease. And if you're unfortunate to have a baby before 32 weeks of gestation, the risk is even greater. And these are things that, again, they happen to young women. And you might say, well, is it just predicting in their older ages of getting heart disease? And we hear this a lot. You have to die from something, so maybe heart disease is okay. Well, it's not, and especially not in these young women, because they tend to go on and have heart disease 10 years after that event. So you think of the age many women are when they're pregnant and have these complications. They're probably in their 20s and 30s, and now maybe some women are having pregnancies in their 40s. But again, still young women in 10 years from that pregnancy. So we have to be very aware that these things, and we as physicians need to be asking about these risk factors that happened, at a different time when the focus really was on the baby more than the mom.
Right. I love the free stress tests. It's so true. I mean, it really, really is. And I learned that the last time we were together, and certainly I've talked about that. So I keep learning more and more stuff, and I want to tell you one of the things I learned from Dr. Pierre Theriault, who is one of the lead scientists over at the Banner Alzheimer's Institute. He talked about one of the leading causes of dementia and Alzheimer's is coronary disease, and it's amazing how they are so connected.
Well, it's good that now neurologists are linking that too, because we now have more evidence that Alzheimer's is related. It's a vascular disease process, and that there's a tie between, if we can keep preventing heart disease, we might have a greater chance of preventing Alzheimer's. So I think those two are so closely intertwined.
I believe so too. Another thing I read in your book, physical inactivity is more prevalent in women than in men, so there is a risk factor that we need to address. Women's hearts respond better than men's to healthy lifestyle changes, yet only 2% of the National Institute of Health's budget is dedicated to prevention.
That should shock everyone. I mean, 80% of heart disease is preventable, and that's true for men or women. And yet we focus, and of course we have to focus on new drugs and new therapies and new treatments that might be very expensive for our society, but are necessary. And I'm not minimizing that, but I do think we should be focusing more of our budget towards prevention, more of our healthcare dollars towards prevention, rather than spending in your last year of life. And that's really where we spend the majority of healthcare dollars.
We do.
And I think that we as a society need to take on the idea that preventive care, should it be covered? Because actually as a society, we would spend less. We spend much more money, whether it's individually out of our own pockets or as a country with the government dollars that go to Medicare in different ways. How do we want to spend that? Wouldn't it be better to be healthier, and then at the end of life, that you don't need things to be as aggressive and as expensive?
I have so many more questions here. And James has given me the one finger saying that we got less than a minute left. Martha, rather than me asking you a question, I would love for you if you could just leave our listening audience with just a final thought to take away and really be able to resonate not only with themselves, but the ones that they love.
Well, I would say that we started off talking that heart disease is the number one killer, and that is so true. It's high, but it is preventable at any age. So there's no age that you can't make changes. But as I said, heart disease is the number one killer. Lack of awareness is a close second. So by just knowing you're at risk, you can start these conversations. And
certainly with women who ignore a lot of the signs. You've been listening to Health Futures, Taking Stock in You. Martha, thank you so much for being here today. Make it a great day. Have a great weekend.
There's no place like home. You've been listening to Bob Roth's Health Futures. If you have questions about your own or your loved one's future health care, call Cypress HomeCare Solutions at 602-264-8009. That's 602-264-8009.